Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Well, thank you very much for joining us once again. Donnybrook is back. Hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We've got lots to talk about, so let's meet the panelists who are with us for this edition, starting with the news director for the Big 550 KTRS, Wendy Wiese, along with Mr. Bill McClellan from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. From rawstory.com, the Riverfront Times, and the Big 550, he's Ray Hartmann, along with Alvin Reid from the St. Louis American, 590 AM, 97.1 FM News Talk. Good to have everybody back. And a little programming note that Richard Rosenfeld, a criminologist at the University of Missouri St. Louis, will join us to talk about gun crime and safety in the greater St. Louis area. And today it couldn't be more timely, his visit. So we're looking forward to that at 5:30. Bill McClellan, I want to ask you, first of all, my thoughts are with you, Bill, because it was announced today that the Missouri Bar and Grill is closing permanently on Saturday. So
yes, thank you.
That was a legendary landmark for sure, correct?
Oh, I spent more than a few hours in there.
And a few dollars too, I'm sure. Well, I want to ask you about Tashara Jones, the treasurer for the city of St. Louis, who, as soon as she won re-election this year, she announced that she would be a candidate for mayor. And she said she was going to deliver her signatures, and she announced to the press that she would walk into the Board of Elections, and she did. She dropped off the signatures. Turns out, however, several hundred were invalid. They included names of people who were no longer living in the city. Rookie error for someone who's run citywide 4 times? Doesn't she have a list of followers who can easily give her signatures?
Oh, I didn't see it as a big mistake at all, and in fact, maybe it'll work to her advantage. This is the kind of thing that office seekers delegate. Especially when there is an experienced as Tashara Jones is, and she has somebody collecting for her, and all of a sudden, this looks bad, but people will forget it soon. But it will be a reminder to her, I'm sure, that you have to pay a little more attention to stuff.
Yeah, and
if she came. Go ahead, Alvin.
No, go ahead. Okay, I was just going to say, it is a mistake, not a huge one, but it's a bad mistake because people are just, look, maybe you're the favorite, maybe you're a slight underdog, who knows, but people are coming after you politically, and this gives them just some more, like you say, just ammo to fire your way. And, I was always taught coming up that for whatever reason, whenever people thought about you and you're trying to get where we wanted to go, you had to be better. If the assignment called for 3 sources, get 5. If she needed 1,500 signatures, she should have said, "Don't come back until you have 2,500," just so this type of thing doesn't occur. So misstep, and got to do better in the long run. And it's a short time. Let me tell you what, the first week of March will be here before we know it.
Does have a target on her back because she came within 800 votes of being mayor in 2017 when she ran against Lyda Crewson. So I think that she is going to have to be very careful, and it's not the best foot to start off on, but if they learn from it, then it will obviously serve her well in the end.
I don't think it makes any difference at all. It's March 2nd and April 6th that matter. And the interesting thing about the layout of this election is it's really March 2nd because there's 2 campaigns. There's one to get into the top 2, as everybody knows, and then they have a 5-week sprint after the marathon to get to the final 2. They've only got 5 weeks to go mano a mano against whoever the 2 are. I think by March 2nd it won't be.
Very well.
I think it'll be.
Thank you, Ray. Let's move on to Alvin Reid. Alvin, our friend Lauren Traeger of KMOV broke a story that some of our local officials, including Sam Page, the county executive, Lisa Clancy, the county council chair, and the prosecutor in the city, Kim Gardner, the prosecutor in the county, Wesley Belt, have an app on their phones which can automatically delete texts. Now, texts for business are supposed to be preserved. It's curious why elected officials who are supposed to preserve some documents would have such an app. This is one of the things that got the former governor, Eric Greitens, in trouble because he had an app that was deleting his texts. I don't happen to think it's that big a deal because I think that a public official, despite what the law says, don't get me wrong, should be able to confide in others, either verbally or through a text, and shouldn't have every single message open to investigation by the public. What do you think?
Well, first, who knows what all Eric Greitens had on his phone? So I don't even want to go there. But no, if you're an elected official, don't use your personal cell phone. Period. Exclamation point. And if you do, you cannot erase anything that has anything to do with county business. And for that matter, even campaign donation talk, things like that. Just don't do it. Like if you get a text to that phone, just don't open it. Don't use it for business. It seems pretty simple to me. I don't know why they even would have to have this on their phone.
Charlie, is your position officially that you're for lawlessness in this case and not, you just said it's against the law, you know it?
But that's okay.
No, I'm not suggesting that people break the law. I just think the law, I don't like the law, Ray, because if I have a conversation, let's say I bring up my cell phone, I can call you as a public official, and that's not open to a public search. But if I text you the same message, then suddenly that's the public record. And I just happen to think that a leader of a government leader should have the ability to say certain things that are not open to the Post-Dispatch and KMOX and KTRS and the St. Louis American.
You know what? People used to get in their car and actually go talk to people.
Right.
Or, call them on the phone from their house. Why can't you do that anymore? It's such a high-tech, fast-paced world.
Amen. I mean, that's where confidentiality comes in, where you think, I don't want this recorded. I'm going to go over and talk to Mr. Reid right now.
Right.
It's just too much of an easy habit to get into, to get on your device and, well, I'll just delete that. Now delete that. I don't think they should have those apps at all.
And I think that especially in this day and age, when you see traditional media organizations downsizing, shedding hundreds of employees at a time, there's a sense, at least for me, that the chicken coop, the door is open and the foxes here are everywhere. And I think we need more transparency, not less at this time.
Well, what I find interesting, it's just about the digital age, and a lot of it when we get into these like sexting scandals, is what part of permanent don't people understand when it comes to electronic communication? So if you have something that you would like to see erased, it seems to me the best policy in general is not to put it in a text, because even as something that's on a piece of paper, I mean, it's permanent, and you don't get to decide whether everybody else deletes it. Okay, it's I just find it fascinating that people would ever put something in a text that could come back to embarrass them.
Well, it's the same thing that we've all said about the emails. Before you hit send, you have to ask yourself, are you comfortable with everybody knowing the contents of this email? If you're an office holder, that goes without saying, you would think.
Hey, let's move to you, Ray Hartmann. You've written recently in the RFT about cleanup in aisle 45. Let's talk about the election results and how some local leaders are reacting to them. I'm told that the junior senator from the great state of Missouri, Josh Hawley, was on the Mark Reardon show on KMOX and said that he wasn't sure who would be the president on January the 20th. Meanwhile, the senior senator on one of the Sunday programs said that he wasn't quite ready to call Joe Biden the president-elect. So what do you make of this?
Well, it's a sad sign of our times. I mean, Joe Biden got elected, and he'll be president on January 20th, and both Roy Blunt and Josh Hawley understand that fully. The problem they have is that Donald Trump gets to take his 89 million Twitter followers with him, and many of them are in the base in Missouri. And so if you're Roy Blunt, the upside, it's pathetic, really, but the downside of irritating the base, in his case, is possibly to draw a 22 primary opponent named Josh Hawley. And for Josh Hawley, he's just hoping that in 24, nobody named Trump is on the ballot, and he can be the loyal Trumpy that carries that mantle.
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about, because I talked to one state Republican leader who said that there's 30% of the Republicans in the state of Missouri who just think that, other Republicans are not doing enough to fight what they see as fraud in the elections. And this group is really, really loyal to Donald Trump, and people are afraid to get on its bad side. And I think that that's not that unusual. Let's face it. There are sacred cows that other politicians don't dare touch. There are third rails of American politics, but I don't really recall seeing anything quite like this.
We don't have the attention span that we used to, though. I'm sorry, Bill.
I think it's bad for Missouri as far as like attracting businesses. I mean, people don't understand how dimly the rest of the country views us. I mean, we're Alabama without a little slice of ocean. We're Mississippi without the cachet. And when we have our senators like Josh Hawley, he's not quite sure who the president is. And Roy Blunt, who's, tried to keep a sliver of distance between himself and the president. Even Ann Wagner, who represents the county, who just embraced Trump. I think that if I'm a business person, especially a high-tech business person, and I see Josh Hawley, who's anti-high-tech, and I see Eric Schmidt joining the lawsuit to make sure that we can still continue to discriminate against gays and lesbians. I mean, I don't know if I want to go to that state. I think that their attitude, while understandable, really hurts Missouri.
Yeah, I agree. And I can't really add much more to that. I mean, except it's shameful. And I still feel as though when you say what Senator Hawley, and compare our two senators, I think they're the same. Okay. And because this whole last year, when nobody, Trump support or not, and base or not, you can't say that this Proud Boy and this racism and these neo-Nazis have got to go. And if that hurts me politically, so what? Because I got to stand up and do the right thing and this nonsense. They're the same to me. I'm looking at Hawley just the same as our senior senator. They've lost me.
Well, we know that for a long time, Alvin. That's not new from you. But I will say this. I
had respect.
Yeah.
I've lost it.
Well, I will say this. I think you're right, certainly about racism and attitudes towards gays and lesbians. I don't think a company wants to move to a state that has attitudes like that. But if there's a senator who is just not saying anything about the aftermath of the election, I don't think that's going to have any effect. But I do overall, I think this is something that people are going to forget real quickly.
Yeah, well, I actually don't. And I do think there's a difference between Blunt and Hall. And I respect what Alvin was saying in terms of being really disappointed, because a lot of us thought Roy Blunt would be more of a kind of guardrail.
Statesman.
But I think they're looking at it. You got to look at the big difference in terms of their ambition. I mean, Josh Hawley, just like he was Attorney General, just passing through. Talk about a flyover state. He's just he could, he's just on his little path. And whether he makes it to 2024 to the presidential ticket, I think is unlikely. But you cannot underestimate this guy's ability to take nothing and turn it into something. He's basically never held an office. He's already on the short list for president. I will say this, that it's just, Blunt, I think they just look at the downside and figure whatever they say about Trump isn't going to make any difference anyway. I'm not defending it. I just think it's just a sad sign of the times. Well, I don't agree that we've ever seen anything like this, though, Charlie, with people's faith in the election being shaken like this.
It's going to be. We've never had this kind of mail-in and the unusual form of voting that we did this time either.
And it worked great. And that's
it did, but it's still, being new, that gives you a whole lot of room to ask questions, whether they obviously nothing's been proven.
I disagree, Wendy. This is insane race-based nonsense. And all of the votes, obviously, that were there cheating in the widespread, where were they at? Where a lot of Democrats and black people vote. This is craziness.
I don't think so. Let me jump in here just briefly. Don't forget, in 2017, there were even some members of our panel who thought that there was collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign.
That's not the
point. There wasn't. There was not. Read the reports.
I did actually.
Who did Bill Barr just appoint to look into the charges of Russian collusion further?
Let's keep it local, but let me just say this.
But speaking of local, why is 2016 election just like people are?
There was more. But what? Go ahead.
Well, my question is, why is it that the mail-in voting was only raised as a problem where
that's true.
Agreed.
You are.
Agreed. But I'm just saying this is how it. I think it perpetuates itself because it's new and people can say,
Courts aren't new, Wendy, and part of the new Republican attack is on the judicial system. And the president saying, what happened to the courts? And we've had the courts around for a long time. And this is the first time I can remember a direct assault on the court system. And with our senators, just sitting there twiddling their thumbs, it's very disturbing.
Well, to have the president assault any branch of the government the way he has verbally, that's a whole new territory for all of us. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch not only how wide the coattails, but how long the coattails are actually in existence for Donald Trump.
He's one for time. Let's move on, guys.
Charlie's 1 for 42 in the courts. He ought to be on the Cubs.
Wendy Wiese. This past weekend, it was reported in our major daily, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, that economic development officials were making upwards of $260,000 a year. You remember on this program, Bob Clark joined us on Donnybrook Next Up, and he was talking about how all these economic development officials are way overpaid. They don't produce any jobs. They don't bring any businesses here. That might be true. However, if a guy is making $250,000, is that too much? If a fella has been working for one economic development agency since 1979 and he's bringing home $114K, actually that's before taxes, is that too much?
I really don't. I don't think it is, and it's one of the old. You know it when you see it. And was it Bob Archibald? May he rest. And I know that he's in Michigan and having probably a great life. But what was he making? It was 800. Was it 800,000? 500. I think anything bumping up against $500,000 or spilling over $500,000 to me in my eyes, that seems a bit much. But 200, when you're in charge of revving up the economic engine of a region as important as ours, if you're in that area between 150,000, maybe 250,000, that is not, you're not owning your own private island with that kind of money. And the job that you're doing is pretty important. And I would imagine quite stressful.
I thought the story was a terrific story, and I thought it was also interesting how much these agencies tried to hide the information. That when the Freedom of Information request was put in, they said, well, we're not, we don't have to divulge this. I thought that's a tell right there. And I would say, 250 grand's not so much if they were doing a great job and the economic engine was revving up, but they're not doing a good job. And I thought it was a great story, and I thought those economic guys are getting way overpaid.
Hey, you stole my thunder, Bill. I was going to say, I could have been hired to manage a baseball team in 1979 at $150,000 a year, and we finished in last place pretty much every year that I was there. Sooner or later, somebody has to come in and say, dude, it's not the salary we're worried about. It's the fact that the job is not getting done. And the job has not been getting done in St. Louis. So then I can begrudge those salaries, Charlotte, because you do have to do something to earn them.
But
well, I don't know. I think. Go ahead, Wendy. I'm sorry.
No, you know that back in the day, Alvin, people were making a heck of a lot more.
Oh, 3 times as much.
Right.
Well, Sheila Sweeney made $500,000. Sheila Sweeney now.
Keep in mind, you can first of all you can add everyone up in the story, and they don't equal what Jeffrey Bonner's making to run the zoo. And I think, but what it brings us to is the point that you can't. And I agree with Bill about the lack of transparency was just kind of shocking.
I give you credit there. That's true.
Yeah. Ray, do we have a world-class zoo? Yes. Are we a world-class economic engine? Heck, no.
It gets to the point, though, and that is
that he's doing his job and he's doing it well. See, I don't have a problem with people who do well.
No, first of all, there's really no objective analysis of how anyone in particular is doing.
What, you want to go city by city? Omaha,
you can't.
Detroit,
economic development,
Chicago, Kansas City.
Right? We're not.
We're the best.
That you got to look at what people in that field are making, just like, I'm sure if they're paying Bonner $5 million, you think it was fine. My point is you got to look at what other people, this is what was so wrong about Archibald. They brought in Fran Levine, it happens to be a woman, for half the price and upgraded with her. And so a lot of it's got to do with what people in that field are making.
No, I was a big enemy of Archibald, but I think you have to look if somebody's being successful. And we've never been running our economic.
And you took a shot at Jeffrey Bonner, and I'm going to defend him. Now, somebody else comes along, maybe not. But the zoo is one of the things we can actually be proud of around here.
Okay, let's move on. Ray, I want to ask you a question, and I'll just try and briefly summarize what's going on in St. Louis County. Restaurants, indoor dining has been banned by the health department, and now some officials like County Councilman Tim Fitch says the health department can't shut it down. State law says it can only be shut down by an elected body. Meanwhile, there was a press conference at Satchmo's, a restaurant, on Monday. Andrew Koenig, who's a member of the General Assembly, wants the General Assembly to shut down restaurants, not health departments. So you take that power away from counties. Also, no business could be shut down for more than 2 weeks in a 2-year period. Also, no limits on indoor gatherings in your home and no prohibitions or restrictions on places of worship. What do you think? Take it away.
Andrew Koenig just got elected for 4 more years in the state Senate, but it doesn't mean anybody should take anything he says seriously. Although, hopefully they won't go that route. It's a complicated issue. I mean, you got to feel for these restaurants because a lot of them, they're but this is a national story that we have a little piece of. At the same time, you look at how stressed our healthcare workers are and our health community and our health department, which I think is doing its best under difficult conditions. And I personally, as much as I've criticized Sam Page over time, at this point, they're in such an impossible position and such an unprecedented position that I have trouble questioning certainly their intent. And I don't know what more. We had Dr. Garza on here, you could visibly see these people are trying to do the best and trying to save lives. And so it's complicated. There's arguments on both sides of it. The one thing I will say that I can understand how some people feel their business is being singled out when they see the big box stores and others, not being as restricted. And I do really understand that, but I can't give up on the fact that the county health department people, I just don't want to second guess them right now.
Well, based on this legislation, the restaurant could be just infested with rats, okay? And so the rats would now have to catch a bus down to Jefferson City and testify that they live in the restaurant. And I mean, this is just, it's just some more nonsense. I understand it's all about pandemic based, but once again, this is politics because the health department should be able to shut down anybody and tell somebody they can't reopen if they have repeated violations. By the way, I looked this up too, and what is all these restaurants that are still staying open? All right, if I'm going to open Alvin's, bar and grill someplace, that local municipality is the first place I have to go and get my business permit, okay? And they'll approve whether I can serve alcohol or not. Then you go to the state. And after the state approves your liquor license, okay, and you have it from the state, guess where you got to go next? To St. Louis County. And I'd be using that weight. If I could give it, I would take it away. So I'll just, if I got to.
But he's tried. And I think another really interesting part of this was Franklin County, which was one of the outlying counties this entire time that, they took their time making these decisions. But the presiding commissioner, Tim Brinker, said today, you can't dispute the numbers, that since they have started enacting these mask requirements, they have seen the numbers plummeting. So that's where we are. There are people who want to follow the rules and make things safer for others, and there are people who don't. And I don't understand it, and I know you don't understand it, but that's the way it's going to be.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that because the health department is under the banner of the county executive and they serve at his pleasure, I think the county executive should have met virtually or otherwise with a group of restaurant owners and tried to find some accommodation or give them some major dollars, because there is, as Ray pointed out, a huge investment in these places, and their futures are just tied to this. Their present day income is tied to it. Couldn't he say, okay, if you open the windows, if you've got a ceiling fan, if you've got a high grade ventilation system, if you limit the tables to 4 at a table, your own family only, and we're going to put up shower curtains separating everybody. I mean, couldn't there have been some meeting in the middle on this, as opposed to one size fits all, shut them all down for indoor dining?
Well, it would have been nice if there was a federal response, Charlie, where Congress was giving money to these restaurants now and saying, we understand that because of the pandemic, these restaurants are going to have to just have carry out or outdoor dining, and we're going to help take care of them instead of the terrible squabble we have in Washington, D.C.
Bill's right. And let's not forget Parson either, because the lack of leadership and the lack of courage, frankly, to do the right thing at the state level, when 37 other states, all of which have lots of little towns and rural areas in them, have all found their way to have state mask mandates, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. We got that timeout sign. Yeah, that unforgiving clock once again has reared its ugly head and said that we have to take a break now. But with Donnybrook next up, we're going to talk to Richard Rosenfeld, criminologist at the University of Missouri St. Louis. We'll be talking about regional crime. That's next.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Well, thank you for joining us for our second half, which we call Donnybrook Next Up. We are so pleased to welcome to our program Dr. Richard Rosenfeld, a criminologist at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and one of the nation's most distinguished experts on crime. In fact, just recently, I saw you quoted Dr. Rosenfeld in the Washington Post, where the story took a look at homicide, up not just in St. Louis, where this year we've had north of 240 murders, but turns out other big cities are also seeing a huge surge in homicide, which is really distressing. Welcome to the program. Can you shed any light on why this seems to be going on in the year 2020?
Well, I hope so. You referred to my appearance in the Washington Post. That's based on several studies I've done now of cities across the country, looking at crime rate changes during the pandemic and also during the mass protests over police violence after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And so, just to kind of set the background, year to date in 20 plus cities that I've looked at, there's been about a 30% increase in homicide, which is quite substantial. In St. Louis, the increase, which began early summer, really coinciding with the emergence of the protests over the George Floyd killing, St. Louis homicides are up about 36% year to date. So we've got a real problem. And a couple of notes. I think the pandemic is a major contributor to the rise in violent crime that we've seen. The pandemic has affected all aspects of society, but that includes police departments. And the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, the city police department, as well as the county police department, had policies in place that reduce social distance or increase social distancing, reduce face-to-face contact between police officers and citizens on the street. Lots of officers have been out sick with the virus, or they've been exposed to someone, a colleague, with the virus. And of those who have remained on the job, they simply have not been able to engage in the kinds of what are called self-initiated activities that can help keep crime in check. Earlier in the summer, we also experienced widespread protests in St. Louis over police violence and police misconduct generally. And police officers in the city were taken off their normal beats and redeployed to address the protest demonstrations. And that too, I think, contributed to the increase in violence.
Very interesting. Wendy.
Yeah, I think that's not the whole story, but the pandemic is a big part of the story.
Chief Hayden was addressing the media after the latest police officer was hit by a projectile this morning, the 10th since June, he said. Are you seeing that kind of police, the police officers under siege? Is that apparent in other cities as well, Professor?
It certainly has occurred in other cities. Portland, Oregon comes immediately to mind, Minneapolis to a degree. But no, I don't think that kind of activity, assaults on police officers, is all that widespread. We have seen indications of that in St. Louis, and other cities have as well. But generally speaking, the protest activity, especially given the size of the protests and their frequency in recent months, generally speaking, they've been largely peaceful, with exceptions.
Bill?
Thank you.
You know, before these protests and before the pandemic, we still had a huge problem, Professor, as you know, as did other cities. And, you know, there's poverty and poor schools and everything. But we have that in rural Missouri, too. Yeah. I mean, we have poverty and we have people using meth, and yet we don't have drive-by shootings. And it seems to be a racial issue. I mean, it's a young Black culture that seems to be shooting each other. How do you change a culture?
Well, you start, it seems to me, by widening opportunities to pursue life legitimately, as opposed to through criminal means. And that means reducing chronic levels of unemployment, providing more and better quality education. You know, it sounds almost these days like a cliche. Those are the kinds of interventions that have been discussed now for decades, since the Johnson administration. And yet we've never fully implemented those recommendations. So that's where I would start. It's going to take a while to untangle the threads of that culture, as you call it, that bring young men out into the streets and at one another's throats over what may seem from the outside to be very trivial issues. Disrespecting someone by holding your glance into their eyes a little bit too long and that sort of thing. But in certain communities, including communities in St. Louis, respect on the streets is about all some young men have. And they protect it often with violent means. So I'm not trying to minimize the point, Bill, at all. This is going to take a while, but I do think the effort has to start with better employment opportunities, better educational opportunities, and a reduction in racial segregation that is still, quite persistent in St. Louis.
Thank you.
Right?
From your perspective as a criminologist, how does the St. Louis region in general, the St. Louis area, compare to other metropolitan areas in crime?
We're in the middle. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll just, that's it.
We're in the middle of the pack. We don't rank all that high as a metropolitan area in serious crime rates. Where we do rank high, in fact, we're the highest of the largest cities, is in our homicide rate in the city of St. Louis. We're now right around 80 homicides per 100,000. That's an extraordinary figure. That's a record for St. Louis. That's an all-time record. And so, needless to say, we've got to move that homicide rate way down. Two other points. One is that I think too many people believe that the 80 per 100,000 chance of a homicide, applies citywide, no matter where you live. But I think all of us know that where the real devastation occurs and has for decades is in really a relatively small number of neighborhoods on the north side of the city and one or two these days on the south side of the city. So those areas are the areas where gunshots are heard on a daily basis. But most people who live in the city of St. Louis don't live in communities that have anything like an 80 per 100,000 homicide rate. That citywide homicide rate is driven disproportionately by the devastatingly high rates we see in just a few areas of the city.
Alvin.
Professor, if I remember correctly, and this is before George Floyd was shot by the police officer, and I guess we technically didn't know how long we would be in this COVID crisis. But if I remember correctly, the murder rate and kind of crime against persons went down like in the earliest weeks or maybe, month and a half after, county and city shut things down. Well, if I'm a murderer or I'm involved in really violent actions, it would seem to me like why would I care about that if I am, this kind of individual? It almost seemed like that a lot of these folks were more afraid of the COVID virus than they were going out and getting shot. I mean, it just psychologically, that just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, as activity on the street went way, way down, I think there was little surprise that homicide rates, most homicides do occur on the streets, would come down just a bit. And you're right, they did in St. Louis for perhaps a month. And then in the latter part of the spring, very early summer, they spiked. And that's the situation, not simply in St. Louis, but elsewhere as well. The other thing I would say is that most of the people who engage in activity that leads to another person's death are probably not accurately called murderers. Most of them have not committed murder in the past. Now, most of them do have rather extensive criminal records, but not for homicide. And in fact, much homicide has an opportunistic quality to it. It's not as if someone wakes up and then plans to murder someone else and goes out to find them and attack them. In fact, most homicides occur because somebody spies somebody else on the street with whom they or an associate of theirs has had a beef, and a conflict ensues and someone is killed. So that opportunistic quality to homicide was reduced somewhat during the beginning of the social response to the pandemic. But as things reopened in the late spring and early summer, and then after the George Floyd killing and mass protests about police violence emerged, that's when we saw our spike.
You know, we've seen quite a bit of a spike since the early part of this century, when in the first decade, homicides were relatively low, but in the 1990s, they really were off the charts also. Right. But the New York Times had a story looking at a Johns Hopkins study that said that our homicides went up after a state law was repealed that required people who wanted a handgun permit to go to their local sheriff or police chief and get a background check.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you agree with that. Is there a connection between the change in the state law and the rising gun violence in our area?
Yeah, that study you referred to, led by Daniel Webster, who's a very, very good public health expert on gun violence. That study was quite sound. And what it showed was that statewide homicide rates went up after that legislative reform. And I think what your comment also calls for is some discussion of the harmfulness of the weapons, of the firearms that are out on the street these days. We've seen a much larger increase in homicides than we have in gun assaults, an assault in which someone happened to be in possession of a firearm, even if he or she didn't discharge it. And what that seems to reflect is the greater lethality of the weapons that are now out on the street compared to a decade or so ago. So when more and more weapons show up on the street, and lax gun laws is a primary reason for the increased flow of these more lethal weapons that have magazines that will contain up to 30 rounds. Weapons that are assault type weapons that allow a shooter to get off multiple rounds in a second or more. Those are the kinds of weapons that produce homicides, not only of the intended victim, but of persons nearby because of the sheer number of rounds that are discharged. So we have to be concerned with the flow of firearms into our communities. And I do think legislation is, or the absence of legislation is an important reason for that in Missouri. But we have to be concerned also with the lethality of the increased lethality of the weapons that are out there now.
I want to kind of circle back, if you don't mind, Professor, to what you were saying to Bill about, you know, when we hear these tragedies, these drive-by shootings, so much collateral innocent damage, and we automatically assume that it has something to do with a drug deal or, you know, some kind of a drug dispute. But you seem to be saying that it could literally just be that moment, that glance of disrespect. Is it that low of a threshold in terms of what can actually lead to someone losing their life today?
Yes, it is. Now, I don't want to discount the drug involvement. The drug markets are quite active, and so many of the disputes that lead to homicide are related to the dynamics of the drug markets. And when it comes to this notion of disrespect, it's not usually that someone is on the street, a stranger approaches and acts in a way that may disrespect someone. Most strangers are of little consequence for most young men on the street. So if you or I were to approach a young man on the street with an extensive criminal record and we held our glance a little too long, I'm not certain he would even notice. But if it's someone he knows or even casually, especially someone who may be part of a rival group, if not gang. That's a very, very different matter because that individual counts. We don't count, but that individual counts. And so the tragedy here is that homicides are so heavily concentrated in that young male, disadvantaged male, I would say, segment of the population, in addition to being so heavily concentrated in just a few neighborhoods, a relatively small number of neighborhoods in the city.
We like to think that somehow there's disassociation or what have you when you talk about young men who have place absolutely no value on life. I am picking up on the fact that what you're saying is they don't care. It has nothing to do with disassociation or anything like that. They don't have anything to live for, maybe.
Well, yeah, in some cases, yes, but remember, respect on the street is all that many young men may have in life that they value. And that respect on the street is quite valuable. The more highly you are respected, the less likely someone is going to take you on, right? So for purely defensive reasons, respect means a lot. I'm not certain it would be accurate to say that most young men involved in homicide don't care about life. My guess is that most do care about their mother's lives, their sisters' lives. But when this issue of respect looms large, when it's the top priority for maintaining face in public, that can often come off as reflecting a lack of respect for life. It simply means that respect on the street is just of primary importance.
Thank you.
Doctor, I think the city is going to spend $7 million on a program called Cure Violence. And it started in Chicago, which makes people like me skeptical of it. I mean, Chicago still has a problem. And you were mentioning Daniel Webster at Johns Hopkins. I think that same study showed that in Baltimore, Cure Violence was not very successful. What do you think about the city spending all this money on Cure Violence?
Well, I will say this, and I'll be as diplomatic as I can and also as truthful as I can. And that was a lot of money to spend on a single program implemented in now just 2 neighborhoods, eventually 3 neighborhoods, and not even the entire neighborhood, but just portions within those neighborhoods. So what I would say is we had all better hope that it works. But even if it's effective in those neighborhoods, its impact on the 240 plus homicides that are currently occurring in the city of St. Louis has to be by design quite limited. There are other programs that the research shows are more effective than Cure Violence and this whole violence interruption program. Other programs that are called focused deterrence programs, in which the criminal justice system gathers together people at high risk for violence because of their prior records or intelligence on the streets, and essentially delivers a 2-pronged message. We obviously know who you are, and we're going to stop the violence. And if you want out of this life, here are services and support that can make a difference. That kind of program is far less expensive than Cure Violence, and the research shows probably more effective. Now, I'm hoping that the Cure Violence effort is effective. I think we all have to hope that it is. But the research record, as you point out, Bill, and other research has shown, is mixed, I think at best, on Cure Violence. And it's mixed for a very kind of what might seem obvious reason. For the program to be effective, you need people who can monitor all the conflict situations in the area and select out, because they can intervene in all of them, just those most likely to result in violence. And then intervene in those and hope that the intervention is effective. That's an enormously difficult challenge for anybody to carry out, even if they've been well trained by the Gary Slutkin group in Chicago. So I hope it works. It's very, very expensive on a cost benefit basis. I think there are other programs. I would nominate focused deterrence, far less expensive, and the research would show consistently more effective.
Doctor, St. Louis is famous for crime. Okay, I mean we are the murder capital of the world, and we own that, and it affects so much else: economic development, tourism, you name it. People even being afraid to go downtown more than ever I can remember. But having said that, without minimizing that, which nobody's going to do, how you mentioned that we're kind of middle of the pack as a region, which would surprise most people. How hard is this? Is it a rationalization, or is it valid for city folks to point out that there's an apples and oranges component to measuring cities when we have the frozen borders from the 1870s, and most other cities' numbers include inner ring suburbs that we have in St. Louis? How much impact should that be? How much should that matter?
Well, you raise a good point, and I've written about this in the past. We do. We have two problems. We have a genuine violence problem in the city that should not be rationalized away, but we also have a crime rate problem. You're right. We have very constricted borders. The city of St. Louis comprises something like 10% of our metropolitan area. Compare that to the city of Memphis. Memphis and St. Louis are quite similar places in all kinds of respects. However, during the late 50s and 60s, Memphis annexed its inner city suburbs. We did not. As a result, the Memphis population is about 600,000. St. Louis population is about 300,000. And so, yes, our constricted borders make a difference. Not everyone who is killed in a homicide in St. Louis resides in the city of St. Louis. And yet the homicide rate is based on the population living in the city. So I think, Ray, you're right to point to that as our crime rate problem. But I wouldn't want people to use it to minimize the genuine crime problem.
I'm not. I just was curious if there's a way, in the manner you described metropolitan regions, is there a way to really get a handle without minimizing?
I've worked on that. Others have worked on that. I once did a study in which I imagined that we had annexed the 10 most populous inner ring suburbs in the city. Had we'd have a crime rate like Memphis's, and not one that's considerably higher.
Alvin?
I'm back. Somebody assaulted my electricity for about 5 seconds there. I don't know what that was about. Professor, you mentioned that police officers reassigned and not making the contacts and face to face. So, maybe hopefully we'll have a more peaceful year next year, and that would help. But it also sounds like you're kind of saying that if I could snap my fingers and hire, another 1,500 police officers and station them in these areas where the homicide rate is so high, that it would reduce the murder rate in the city of St. Louis.
Yeah, I think it would. And there, the research is very clear that if you elevate patrols in those areas where violent crime is heavily concentrated, that's the so-called hotspots strategy. That does help to reduce crime. We wouldn't need to hire another 1,500 officers to bring that about. In fact, what I would argue is that we need to take the essence of the call for police reform more seriously. And by that, I don't mean defund the police or anything like that. What I do mean is make changes that enable our city police department to pay greater attention and devote greater time to its core mission. And in the city of St. Louis, the core mission, no one would dispute this, is to address serious violent and serious property crime. So what that means is we need other personnel, other agencies to take over from the city police department some of the activities the police department now are the first responders for. First and foremost would be responding to drug overdoses. The fire department has been in the emergency medical services business for decades now and is much better positioned to respond to drug overdose, very few of which involve interpersonal violence and would require a police officer.
Professor, I'm afraid to say we're going to have to leave it there because our time is up for this segment. But thank you so much for your time, and thanks for joining us on Donnybrook Next Up.
Thanks for the discussion. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor. I learned a lot.
Good. Me too.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.